All right, let's look at another phase shift here. Let's go through and do our amplitude, midline, period, quarter period, phase shift, domain and range. So let's do our amplitude. And our amplitude is, that's just a 1. Our midline, nothing's hanging off the end here for k, so it's just y equals 0. Our period, well, I'm going to look again. Is there a b here? Nope, our b is just 1. So our a equaled 1, our k equaled 0, and then we have our period being 2 pi because there's no change in b. Let's see, that would make our quarter period the same as always, pi over 2. All right, now let's talk about our phase shift since that's what we're doing in these problems. So our phase shift is located here. And remember, it's the opposite direction. So our phase shift is actually going to go to the left, 3 pi over 2. All right, so let's write that down in our list. It's going to go 3 pi over 2, and it's going to shift left. It's always opposite. All right, so let's go ahead and mark this up. We have our midline here at y equals 0. And let's draw our scale in. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3. This is 2 pi. And then 1, 2, 3. And this is 3 pi. Oops, sorry. Marked that up wrong. 3 pi, 4 pi. There we go. We can say negative pi over here. All right, so we'll mark our other axis is going up 1 and down 1 when we skip like that. So our quarter period is pi over 2. All right, so that's going to mean, well, our graph's already in pi over 2 every tick mark, so we'll be good to go every tick mark. So let's start plotting these points. So normally with cosine we'd start off the line at a maximum. So I'm typically starting here at 1, but I've shifted to the left 3 pi over 2. Oh goodness, I don't have enough on my graph. Let's try to do that. So if I go, that'd be pi over 2. That'd be 2 pi over 2. And that would be negative 3 pi over 2. So I'm somewhere over here. We can just add that in. Let me see. That's negative 3 pi over 2. All right, I know my quarter periods. I'm going to go every tick mark for me to place my next point. All right, I don't have to do any jumping on my scale. So I'm going to be up here. I've started at a maximum, and I'm back 3 pi over 2. And now I'm going to start going down, down, up. There we go, and just start my pattern. And I know that I'm not missing any of these. I'm going to draw that in. So I have me going like this. And actually with that particular phase shift, it looks a little different. It looks like almost like a sine, right? Because it's starting, instead of its maximum, starting there. All right, let's look at, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to do the domain and range. That should be easy for us because our domain is negative infinity to infinity. We should all know that one. And then my range, well, that's just my max and my min here. So my range goes from negative 1 to 1. All right, let's look at this, what happens when we have a value in here for b. So what we need to do is first, we need to factor this 2 out. So we need to factor out b from each. So if I do that, I'm going to get sine. If I factor that 2, I got to take it out of there too. So in reality, factoring is like division. So I'm dividing 2. So I'll have sine of 2x minus pi over 2. All right, so here, it's still my b, it's B in here or it's B out of here. But now with a phase shift, remember, in order to determine your phase shift, this has to be a 1 in front of the x. And now that we factored the 2 out, we can now see that our phase shift is pi over 2 to the right. So let's go through and do everything. We have the amplitude, the midline, the period, the quarter period, which will help me figure out what all of my things need to be on my graph. And then let's see, we're going to do our phase shift as well, domain, and then the range. So our amplitude in this case is 1. Our midline's y equals 0. Our period, well, that's 2 pi over the absolute value of b. So that's 2 pi over, and what is b? b is 2. So my period is just pi. So that means that depending on however I make my scale, my quarter period is going to end up being my period over 4. And well, that's all set. So my quarter period is pi over 4. All right, so let's do our phase shift. Our phase shift is going to be going right pi over 2. And I can just sneakily do the domain quickly because I know that that's negative infinity to infinity. So let's draw my midline in. That hasn't changed in any of these problems. It's not what I want to focus on right now. All right, let's look at the axis here. 0's good. If I have a period of pi and my quarter period's pi over 4, all right, so let's see how that happens. If I mark these up, if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, I'll be at pi. 1, 2, 3, 4, I'll be at 2 pi. And this is negative pi over 2. Pi over 2. So this might be helpful to figure out how I'm moving. So I know that every one of these tick marks is pi over 4. All right, and that's my quarter period. So let's go ahead and plot these points. Let's see, let's use blue and sign on the line. So I'm starting typically on the line, but I want to go my phase shift of right of pi over 2. So that means I'm shifting to pi over 2 and making my first dot. Trying to make my first dot. Let's see if I can get a different color. There we go. So that's where I'm starting. That's my sign on the line at right at pi over 2. Then I know that all of my quarter periods are pi over 4, which is what each of these hash marks are. So I'm going to go up my amplitude, back down, down. So it's rather painless. You're just starting at a new point with phase shift. That's all we're doing. Starting at a new point. So let's see, let's put this all together. We'll go this way. Ooh. Try to make it a nice smooth curve. There we go. And we can see that my range is negative 1 to 1. All right, let's do it one more time. Here we have a phase shift, but we need to figure out what it is once this gets factored out. So when we do that, we have cosine of 1/3 x. Okay, that got rid of there. But now I have pi over 6. Remember I said when you factor out, you're really just dividing by it. So if I divide by 1/3, I'm actually, what's happening? I have pi over 6 times 3 over 1. It ends up being 3 pi over 6, which ends up being pi over 2. So this right here is going to end up being x plus pi over 2 once this gets factored out. Let's check it. If I multiply it back in, 1/3 x plus pi over 6. Yep, check. So here's my equation that I want to work with. So let's go over the amplitude, the midline, the period, the quarter period, the phase shift, the domain, and the range. The amplitude is 1, the midline is 0, the period is 2 pi over b, absolute value of b, which is 2 pi over 1/3. All right, well that's going to be 2 pi times 3 when we flip and multiply. So that's my period. My period's 6 pi. All right, so my quarter period, if I went to calculate that, it'd be my period over 4, which is actually 3 over 2. That's my quarter period. That's what all of my tick marks are going to be. And then my phase shift, that's going to go to the left, pi over 2. And let's just do our domain range really quick. And the range, since we don't have any amplitude change, it's still going to be -1 to 1. So let's try to graph this efficiently. There's my midline. Let's come up with my scale. Coming up with my scale, and I was trying to figure out how I wanted to present this to you. Since my graph isn't quite long enough, we kind of have to do a little fiddling, but my phase shift is pi over 2. So it would be nice if I could just go pi over 2. If I did that, I'd have pi over 2 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, 5 pi. You couldn't fully see the 6 over there, but we can kind of make that happen going back this way. Another way I would have done it is to make this 1 pi itself and then figure out how we're going. So this is like our quarter periods are kind of different from how we're planning on this to happen. But let's just try to figure out with this scale here if we can get a full 2 periods in. So if I was to start to graph this, where cosine we're at a maximum, and I'm shifting to the left at pi over 2. Oh, that's good. I can do that over here. But the only thing is I can't follow straight down because that's only pi over 2. So I need to figure out my quarter period and how I'm going to go about to the next point. So I need to go 3 pi over 2. Well, that's only 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2. So I'm going to 3 pi over 2 over here. 1, 2, and then we're down here. 1, 2. So I kind of need to make it happen every 2 tick marks. Every 2 tick marks. That's the kind of one of the more difficult ones. It depends on the scaling. So when I'm going through I'm down here somewhere. Oops. I'm not down there. I apologize. I'm 2 over here. There we go. It's a fairly wider graph, and that's because our period is fractions. So it's going to take me longer. So I can't really, unfortunately, fit it. We could have worked our scale a little differently, made it a little less, and that would have changed how it looked.